Chapter 1, Defining Cults. Twice in less than 15 years, we have been shown the deadly ends to which cult followers can be led. In 1978, aerial photos of 912 brightly clad followers of Jim Jones, dead by cyanide-laced drinks and gunshots in a steamy Guyanese jungle, were shown in magazines and on television, reappearing with each subsequent anniversary of the end of Jonestown. And in early 1993, television news programs showed the Koresh's cult shootout. Then, several weeks later, its flaming end on the Texas plains. How many more Jonestowns and Wacos will have to occur before we realize how vulnerable all humans are to influence? In the time between these two episodes, nearly 100 cult children and mothers died from lack of care in Indiana, and there were reports of numerous other children and adults abused in cults. A California-based cult tried to murder a lawyer by placing a rattlesnake in his mailbox because he'd won 3 cases against the group. Synanon. The Rajneesh cult in Oregon attempted to poison the water supply in the town of The Dalles and harm public officials in Wasco and Jefferson counties for carrying out the laws of the state, which the group didn't want applied to them. Cult members who were once ordinary citizens have been persuaded by each of these and other groups to carry out group whims, including murder, suicide, and other violent acts at the behest of the cult leader. The cults whose names you tend to recognize are more visible because of their size, their flagrant behavior, and for some, their self-destructive tendencies. But there are many other groups that are subtle and sophisticated, yet just as insistent and just as dangerous. A multitude of cultic groups is actively recruiting, flourishing, and gaining money and power in the United States and throughout the world. These groups exploit and abuse their members or followers through deliberate mind manipulations or thought reform processes. These mind manipulations can be used in a number of contexts or settings. In this book, we will be looking at 2 main categories of groups. The first is made up of the cults and cult-like groups who expose their recruits and members to organized psychological and social persuasion processes designed to produce attitudinal changes and to establish remarkable degrees of control by the group over these recruits and members' lives. These cults deceive, manipulate, and exploit their members and hope to keep them for as long as possible. The second category consists of the commercially sold large group awareness training programs and other self-improvement, psychology-based, or miscellaneous organizations that use similar, intense, coordinated persuasion processes, but ordinarily do not intend to keep their customers for long periods of membership. They prefer that adherents buy more courses and products and bring in more customers, staying around for perhaps a year or 2. Thus, groups in both categories use thought reform processes. The originators of cults and thought reform groups tend to conjure up coordinated programs of coercive influence and behavior control using ages-old persuasion techniques in order to change people's attitudes around a vast array of philosophies, theories, and practices. These masterful manipulators appear to be aware that they need to put into place a packaged set of influence techniques, tactics, and strategies in order to convince others to follow them and go along with their bidding. Not every one of these groups meets the definition of a cult, but along with cults, all of them use thought reform techniques in recruiting, changing, and exploiting followers. See Chapter 3 for a more detailed discussion of thought reform processes. Do you have any idea how many cultic groups are disguised as legitimate enterprises? As restaurants, self-help groups, business training workshops, prosperity clubs, psychotherapy clinics, martial arts centers, diet plans, campus activities, and political organizations? Rather than withering away, as many people believe, cults and groups using thought reform processes have grown like mushrooms after a rainstorm. Currently, depending on how one defines a cult, there are anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 cults in the United States alone. Over the past 2 decades, as many as 20 million people have been involved for varying periods of time in one or another of these groups. And not only are the cult members affected, but millions more family members and loved ones worry and wonder, sometimes for years, about what has happened to their relatives or friends. Not everyone who's approached by a cult recruiter ends up joining the group, and not everyone who joins stays forever. But enough do join and stay for long enough periods of time to make cults a pressing societal problem that merits serious inspection. And I'm not talking about a problem that can be dealt with by a philosophical debate or a hot expose on a television talk show. The threat presented by cults goes much deeper than that. I'm talking about the very real threats to public health, mental health, political power, and democratic freedoms, as well as growing concerns over consumer issues, that become apparent as we learn how these manipulative and often unethical groups and programs have spread into not just the nooks and crannies, but also the major sectors and institutions of our society. Cults are no longer solely a concern for parents who observe their idealistic and in some cases disaffected young adult children being recruited, as was the case in the 1960s and 1970s. For in the 1980s and 1990s, we have seen cults seduce people of all ages and all income brackets. In the past, cults gained a foothold by attracting the so-called marginal people, the unaffiliated, the disenchanted, the disgruntled of each generation. But today's cultic groups have so professionalized their approaches and techniques of persuasion that they are moving well beyond the fringe and into the mainstream. They want you. I have interviewed more than 3,000 persons who have been in one or another, or in some cases, several of the multitude of cults in the United States, as well as hundreds of relatives of cult members. I've also studied dozens of persons who've been involved with other high control groups and numerous individuals, usually women, who have had their lives taken over by a single individual who controlled them as much as if they had been in a cult. From this life experience and more than 50 years of study, research, and clinical practice, I can only say that whenever I think I've heard it all, along comes new evidence that is even more outlandish than the last. In this book, I attempt to explain how ordinary citizens leave their everyday lives and become part of groups that carry out acts ranging from bizarre and unethical to self-destructive and murderous. Cults seem to have no end to their peculiar practices. Cult leaders seem to have no end to their unconscionable behaviors and their capacity to abuse their followers. Cult members seem to have a stamina almost beyond human comprehension. And after they leave cults, former members clearly have a boundless spirit and unbeatable will to heal themselves, reclaim their independence, and come out on the positive side of horrific experiences. A spirit and a will that I can only admire and uphold more and more with each person I meet.